Architecture of Practice, Research, Reflections and Reformulations is a mid-career retrospective exhibition of RMA architects looking at 30 years of a particular practice situated working out of Bombay as well as having a connection in Boston, and what it means to understand or look at an architecture practice, especially in the last 30 years. In India, there's largely been a practice where monographic books, monographic exhibitions have been produced largely by the architect or by the architect's studio themselves. In this case, the architecture studio and the producers of the exhibition invite a curator to come and look at the work and put this exhibition together. For many practices that may have got established around this time period, it must have been a very, very important space to be in, because the 1990s, as we all know today, are a crucial turning point, not only for history and politics in India, but for history and politics all across the world. The 1990s are marked by what we termed as globalization. The 1990s are marked by important economic developments all across the world. In India, marked by the opening up of the liberalization policy in 1991, and obviously the very important event which has shaped many things in contemporary India, which is the demolition of the Babri Masjid on 6 December 1992. So, from economics and politics to culture, many things shifted in the 1990s. Many cities in fact changed their names in the mid 1990s. So, what would it have meant for a very young practice to establish itself, especially in a city like Bombay, which itself was going through very drastic changes? The city of Bombay is where the urban drama, as far as India is concerned, and even globally, plays out the strongest. So, a practice to be nestled or to be sort of based in a city such as Bombay and in a country like India would be a very special moment. And when a fledgling practice is trying to shape its own career, shape its own base, shape its own ideas, you also have this tumultuous context that was all around them. The practice also allows us to reflect in terms of how architecture responded to the context of this change of the 1990s, how architecture responded to the context of the city of the 1990s. The principal lead architect, the founding architect, is himself also a very important writer, researcher, activist, academic. And in that sense, Rahul Mehrotra has literally led these two parallel lives. On one hand, the life of being an architect who is running an architecture practice, an architecture studio, making buildings, but on the other hand, an architect who is constantly writing books, doing research, setting up city conferences, shaping legislation in the city. But why I emphasize the parallelness is because both these lives were taken independently and equally seriously. One was not a hobby life of the other. So, whether he was making and shaping buildings and projects, or whether he was making and shaping and writing books and research programs, he did both of that with independent clarity and independent intensity. And in that sense, what is I think important, that any architecture practice that is shaping and making buildings, this question of how alive and aware are you of the times you inhabit, the times that you contextualize yourself in, becomes extremely and very, very important. Right at the beginning, from a curatorial perspective, there was an identification of about 3 key concepts. These 3 concepts come from me as the curator, but they also come from my understanding of what are the issues that have been influential and important for Rahul. So, the 3 key concepts as to guide me as the curator in this exhibition, the first is the question of context. Now, at one point we realized that Rahul and myself both were interested in looking at context as a dynamic idea. For both of us, context is something that is dynamic and shaping at all points in time. What would be, for example, the context of Bombay? And at this point, I would also like to point you to a lecture that Rahul does called The Context of Context, which is also available on YouTube. Also, this question as to how architecture creates context. The second concept is something that has been of a certain kind of an urgency and concern for us, which is the issue of architecture language. I think in sort of looking at architecture in contextualized conversations, we have somewhere sort of missed out on the question that architecture is shaped by language. Like any cultural form, whether it's literature or music or theatre, it's shaped by language. the meaning, the conversation, the message, the politics, everything is contained within that language. So the question of language was something that I wanted to essentially pick up in this exhibition. And in my own observation, some of the works of RMA architects also would allow me to pick up this question of language, as we will see later in the exhibition. And the third key concept that I wanted to pick up is the notion of continuity. The notion of continuity can be understood at two levels. One is, let's take the simple level first. You are looking at the career of a studio, you are looking at the biography of an individual and his studio, and instead of a banal sense of imagining that there is something continuity from day 1 to day 100 and day 1000, the notion of continuity was actually the notion of change. When there are constant changes, how does a practice maintain a sense of continuity for itself? How do we respond to the notion of continuity in terms of time and geography, in terms of city and history? What one is sort of trying to understand within the work of RMA architects is what nurtures and cultivates the connections between practice and the world of public lives. We realize that the most important and the absolutely one key question that emerged in that exhibition was the role of the architect. The role of the architect as somebody who shapes the public space, or who sort of pushes himself or herself through his or her work, was something that turned very crucial. So our curatorial discussions, our curatorial intentions, we finally shaped this exhibition along three very important axes. The first axis is essentially a chronological study, and I will detail all these three axes one by one, which we actually termed as the notion of thinking through time. The second is where we look at the notion of the studio as the architect's workspace, but also the question of the process. And that's the area that we've called thinking through making. And the final and the third axis, where we look at a very small but a very precise selection of projects, which we call building through ideas, is where we look at some of the most recent projects and in a particular way discuss those projects. We began by sort of looking at chronology, and I think the chronology has been an important aspect for us, because even in our earlier collaborations, whether it was the State of Architecture exhibition or the State of Housing exhibition, chronology was literally our starting point for research. It also became the most important thinking tool. And this chronology was literally prepared already for the book Working in Mumbai, which is authored by Rahul Mehrotra, which covers the work of RMA architects. This produces an important moment of question, dilemma, threshold, very interestingly, that Rahul Mehrotra himself has reflected on his practice till about a year ago. And here, in a sense, Mehrotra has literally the license and the right to do it, not simply as the author, as the sole important voice on his or her own work, but Rahul Mehrotra as the critic, Rahul Mehrotra as the academic. So it's reflections that are personal, and then it's reflections that are sort of more contextual in many, many ways. So these reflections became, in a way, the second starting point for me, in a sense reflecting on what I was seeing, how and why. Because even if you look at this chronology, besides the projects that happened year after year, you also have a note of what were the conferences Rahul Mehrotra was attending or organizing himself, what were the publications that he was involved in, what were the other research projects that he was looking at, what were the conservation projects kind of that he was doing. So this is quite an elaborate chronology that is there. And for me to then start reflecting that if I see an interior design project in Rahul's work, why is it happening, how is it happening? With my own interest as a historian, some of these projects and notes in the existing chronology literally became very important research and archival material. So one of the key things, for example, that I would like to discuss is where, looking at the interior design projects, I started thinking more sharply about how do we understand interior design as a typology. And it was very clear that interior design was not the cash crop practice that most architecture practices or studios consider today. But interior design became a way of understanding the post-liberalized urban societies that we were living in. because cities were producing very different kind of working cultures, very different kind of working professionals, much smaller firms, different kinds of jobs were emerging in the post-liberalized scenario. And the cities were not going to change overnight. So the city fabric had to be appropriated and reappropriated for things that were emerging so quickly overnight post-liberalization. And that you can understand that on one hand, Rahul is co-authoring one of the most important books on Bombay along with Sharda Dwivedi, Bombay, the Cities Within. And this book, as I always say, is not simply an urban history. In fact, this book is actually looking at the city's history through the question of urban development. And what are the 1990s? The 1990s are again another moment where the city is changing through the questions of urban development. That is why the questions of urban heritage become important. So interior design is now sitting amongst these different conversations and questions, and in that sense interior design becomes a completely new typology. And if you look at the way some of these interior design projects are handled, many of them are in old or heritage buildings or in the context of heritage buildings, you clearly see that for Mehrotra or RMA architects, it was not about simply sort of being subservient to an old building, but it was literally about developing a language that could be with the old building and yet accommodate the aspirations of a new working culture or a new working class. A similar conversation then happens with heritage conservation. So heritage did not only simply mean looking at 19th century architecture or colonial architecture, but pretty recent architecture which was already existing in the city had to be very often readapted for new use, like we see in this particular case for the factory at Ecomax. The other typology, for example, in this decade that is emerging and is still happens to be one of the most popular typologies for many architecture studios, is the vacation home, the home outside the city. Now, it's interesting how Rahul very early on understands this typology as a typology that is between urban and rural, and then develops a series of gestures within his design that accommodate the context of the rural, rather than simply be parachuted spaces of the urban into the rural landscape, which are then simply made pretty by a thatched roof or by a terracotta sloping roof, etc. And then it would be interesting to see that one of the most recent research projects that Mehrotra has done is the research project called Becoming Urban, where he develops a thesis he has been talking about for the last 5 or 6 years, which is about how the Indian landscape is today not that easily divided into the urban and the rural. So a certain set of projects in the 1990s are shaping into a much larger research argument 20-25 years down the line. And I think these kind of commentaries became the first most important thing. So every decade of the chronology is sort of marked by a brief or a short essay on the chronology which raises some of these points, which are partly commentary on the work of RMA architects, but they are partly commentaries from my perspective as a historian or a critic into understanding what typologies mean. After that, what I did was began to identify a couple of thematic stories. Some of them were very architectural observations, but we identified, for example, the question of critical conservation. So in fact, conservation is something that Rahul Mehrotra and his work has always been known by. As somebody who's been involved in shaping the first legislation for heritage conservation in the entire country, somebody who's been involved in organizing some of the most crucial conferences on heritage conservation in Bombay. As a practitioner, how does he approach the question of conservation? And here it was interesting because in his body of work, you see interior design approaching the question of heritage conservation. You see old buildings that may not have the tag of being heritage, but still they are old buildings that are ready for a transformation, the way families are changing, the way business relationships are changing, or basically the emergence of things like old buildings being converted to museums or boutique shops, etc., or even do something like the Taj Mahal master plan for the conservation of Taj Mahal in Agra. So in his body of work, you see a range of approaches, and one of the most important projects is the CSMVS, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya project, where literally, as we will talk later, right from early days of his practice to even today, it's a site that they have engaged in with multiple smaller projects and insertions rather than one large heritage project. So here it was clear that conservation is not about old buildings. Every conserved building is a contemporary building. And somewhere in the way Rahul has managed or handled a lot of these projects, I could sort of further that argument by saying that even for Mehrotra, conservation was a practice of today. If we look at another theme, which is a theme that I realized was or had rather developed within the RMA studio itself, which was looking at terracotta. RMA architects realized at one point in time that they had been using a particular material, and it's not a practice that had sort of either labeled itself or promoted itself. Without tagging itself, they had used a large amount of projects had used terracotta. What I realized is that they were interested in the material, and later I can see their interest, for example, in another element like louvers or another element like vertical gardens, that the studio begins an interest in particular elements of architecture which they see happening more often in their studio. And then it becomes an investigation where a team, including getting a special photographer for the research work, traveling to places where the product is being manufactured, where experiments are being done. And here the interest in material is not revival clearly, but here the interest in the material is its continuing importance in architecture. The next two themes are in fact much more sort of architectural working. And these themes came from my close observation of the work that was happening or the buildings that were being produced by RMA architects in the last few years. Also specifically, the CEPT University library building played a very important role because it's a building that I have myself been using over the last 4.5 years. And I think it's a turning point building in the practice of RMA architects. One was a very important realization when I was writing my own sort of critical review a few years ago on this building, including an interview that I did with Rahul Mehrotra on the Novartis campus building that they did, is a realization that they were working with cross sections in architecture very strongly, that buildings were being designed and shaped and thought through their cross sections. Now, very often I would throw some idea like this with my own sample of a few buildings to the team at RMA. And then the team at RMA would respond by even sharing some other buildings with me, saying that, oh, if you're looking at it like this, then look at this building. The curatorial process was a lot about interacting and engaging with the team at RMA architects. So here clearly you started seeing a range of projects which were dealing with the question of cross section very, very clearly, and the architecture was emerging out of the cross section. And the last short story was around facades. Again, 2 or 3 buildings drew my attention very strongly. First was the KMC Hyderabad building designed by RMA architects, then the Novartis campus building in Basel, and finally the CEPT University library building. I clearly realized that there was a certain play or a certain architectural idea around the facade. I never really bought the idea that the facade is only a gift wrapping or only the periphery of a building. For me, the facade was an integral component of architecture. Besides the way the 19th century architecture shaped the notion of the urban based on building facades, clearly in the contemporary, there was a different role that the facades were playing, again in the context of the urban or in the context of the context. So whether it was developing a series of vertical gardens in a campus in Basel, or for a corporate building in Hyderabad, where a corporate typology was being sort of rethought through this question of the vertical garden. Whereas in the CEPT campus, the library building at the CEPT campus, the facade is, as I say, nearly 50% of the building. It is the facade that literally shapes the architecture. And the actual library building is nestled inside a really thick facade. So the facades are not simply the louvers, but the facade is actually the space of light, the space of literally visual occupation that is between the louvers and the main library building. So the facade then became the final and the fourth sort of short story. And the third layer was actually much more playfully done, but it is in a sense anachronistic. I extracted a lot of pieces from Rahul's larger essays, chapters from books, etc. One set, the red set, largely sort of comes from working in Mumbai. The yellow set comes from all his other set of writings, and I basically started making connections. Maybe he's writing something in the 1990s, an essay that he writes in 95. But you see a clear reflection of those ideas somewhere in 2016. Or something he is commenting in 2016, 2017, 2018, but it is coming from something that happened in 98 or 97. So in a very playful way, what you will read will have certain sort of affinities and resonances between what he's thinking as a critic and a researcher and the kind of practice that is happening and the cross-thinking. So till now we were looking at thinking which was more in time, which was more thematic, but now we are actually seeing how ideas can jump across time. And in that sense, if you look at some of the more, it is literally between 2016 to 2020 that even we have collaborated on certain very important broad research projects such as the state of architecture in India or the state of housing in India. Rahul Mehrotra himself sort of doing a series of urban exhibitions. Now finally what you will see in this chronology is a broad selection from a large number of publications that Rahul has. We have made a short selection of a couple of books that we see as transformational. So clearly books like the Kumbh Mela, where earlier he had sort of already developed an idea for the ephemeral city, where he then sort of shapes the idea into a study of the Kumbh Mela, which is a collaborative project between different departments. And in fact, the Kumbh Mela becomes, it gets translated into Hindi and is probably the first full-length planning study that you will find in Hindi. And clearly these kind of books come from a series of other books such as Extreme Urbanism that he does, where he connects what he is interested in as a researcher and the way he conducts his studio. So his personal research feeds into the studio, into a design studio, and that studio then feeds back into the research project. So this connecting your life between practice, academics and research is something that you see very often. So this completes the chronology axis, and in that sense it really becomes the deepest part of the exhibition. The second axis is kind of a twin axis. It's a twin between the question of the space of the studio and the question of process in design. The studio, the office, the bureau is the space of action. And on the other hand, everybody always has this question, what is the process of design? What is your process of design? And the question is that process of design is not something that you sort of formulate. At one level, these two questions in the case of the RMA Architects Studio come together. If you've ever sort of been to RMA Architects, their studio space, you encounter entering into an office. It's a classic Bombay space divided by these racks. And these racks are stacked up with models. And you clearly realize that these are basically working models that as the studio, as different teams are working on different projects, which is why to have this large image of the studio was very, very important in designing this exhibition. And in that sense, through the axis of this table, on the other hand, you literally see two of the racks that we literally brought from the studio across the road. There are a couple of overlapping stories I would like to talk about. One is in bringing two racks with its cluster and stacks of model is for me an interesting connection. A, the studio as an exhibition space, and here the exhibition as a studio space. RMA studio is literally across the street from here, not even 5 minutes away. And we brought these models into this gallery space, which at one point was the lecture hall of the Goethe-Institut. Now, the Goethe-Institut Gallery MMB has been at the center of many focused conferences, discussions, lectures on Bombay's history, of which Rahul Mehrotra has been an important and integral part. And between these two sort of moments of the studio, you have this sort of large working bench on which this cluster of models literally come together. I sort of referred to the German concept of the Stammtisch, the table of deep and agitated or very interesting discussions. The models are obviously exhibitionary objects, no doubt about that. But the point of bringing these models into the exhibition space is much, much larger. Here literally you see models which have been part of the working process of 6 projects that we selected. None of these models that you see on this table, except for one at the end, was specially produced for the exhibition. The only model that was specially produced for the exhibition is the model of the entire Prince of Wales Museum or the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya site for 2 reasons. RMA is currently doing one of its latest projects on the site there, and also the museum is celebrating its 100 years, and they wanted to have a complete site model. And these models are of different nature, different kinds. You will not find a consistency. So, for example, here we are looking at the Novartis campus building projects, and you can see 2 conceptual models. Then you see this kind of model that is understanding the form space relationship, the building in its entirety, but at the same time you see a model that is largely the wall cross section. And here you see framed the building as it was published with the art project. Here you see a bunch of models belonging to the Sept library. So, this model, which is actually closed, but in fact this was the model that was used by the team of architects when they first made a presentation to the client. It was a little bit of a surprise for the client because they were wondering how a building half the size was accommodating the program that they had demanded from the architect, till he sort of splits open the model and reveals the most important decision in design, which to take the half building underground and keep half the building up, because Rahul was also responding to the existing buildings that were on campus, which are now sort of being seen as modern heritage. In fact, you can see how the facade was still being treated as a brick facade. Later they sort of start experimenting with a louver facade. Then clearly in this model you see the notion or the idea of the louvers fairly well developed, yet not totally final, till they reach a final stage in this model, which is a complete detail, again a model that you can open up and you can see the different elements of the building. And much later when they were sort of detailing the building, suddenly here you see, which is literally a 1:1 model of the door handle. And in fact it's not funny that I was in fact in the office when the model makers and the team of architects were experimenting with me, and they in fact kept telling me that put your hand inside and see how comfortable is it, does your hand hold, does your hand work. So, these models are essentially in a strong conversational sense with each other, and then they are spotted by a few objects. I'll specifically talk of two objects. Now, like every studio, every workspace, there are certain objects that are always lying around in Rahul's office. In fact, I have certain favorite objects like the 3 monkeys of Mahatma Gandhi or the coward. So, we decided to bring some of those objects in the models table and in the models rack. Now, this one has a little bit of a special story, the Rajasthani coward. It just so happened that when I was doing my sort of review essay on the Sept campus library building, I was trying to explain how this Sept library building object works, because it has a certain layering of cross section in the vertical, but I also saw that there was a certain layering of cross section in the horizontal in this building. And I suddenly in a moment of writing saying the building is literally like the coward, the sort of the mool rasa that is going to express this building. The other object which also forms a little bit of an axis, you see the Jain Kayotsarga Purusha there, and you also see a small model which has been lying around in Rahul's studio there. Now, that is an object that has been lying around in Rahul's office. That actually cutout is something that we used in the State of Architecture exhibition. That cutout was a memorial reference to the Vistara exhibition that was designed by Charles Correa and a bunch of Bombay architects in the 1980s. And that image was the introductory image, and as a memorial of that exhibition, in our exhibition in 2016 we bring that cutout. This studio would have so many collaborative practices
Many of these objects are also about these overlapping collaborations. These different objects tell you different stories. For example, this object that you see here, in fact, the whole story, and now RMA has done about 4 small new insertions in the CSMVS Museum campus. They all began by putting together a conservation report, doing sort of measure drawings. And that process of preparing a sort of a plan or a future plan through a conservation report slowly emerged into small different projects. But there is also a story of the Kalagoda Arts Festival and working on a public urban festival that also led to the design of one of the buildings, which is the entrance building with the visitors centers. So, these different objects along with the models tell you how these different stories, different narrations, different collaborations or different ideas for different projects have actually come together. And the advice to most of our audience is to look at the relationships of different objects. You start seeing certain elements, certain ideas that have changed, that have matured, and that's the whole point of even the idea of the Stammtisch or even the idea of the dialogic table. The models stacked up in these sort of racks literally became the story of how the studio was growing over 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, with these different stages of different projects being all sort of accounted for or documented in these racks. One thing that was a major discussion or a conversation to bring into the exhibition was literally a live mock-up of one of the elements of the building, and we sort of through certain discussions decided on the louvers. In fact, the first time when they sort of used the louvers extensively in the Sept University Library building, a mock-up of this was made on site to check out its working, to check out its angles, to check out its details. A similar thing had been done when the KMC Hyderabad project and vertical gardens were sort of used extensively. There was a whole mock-up made on site, certain working was actually developed on site. So, this continuation of the studio to the site, but also the idea of the models from scaled models to live or 1:1 models was something important to be brought into the exhibition space, but it also makes a link to the next and the third axis for us, which was to present a set of projects inside the exhibition space. So, obviously as an exhibition of a studio, of an architecture studio, to bring projects into the exhibition space was obviously very, very important, inevitable. But the question was, how would we decide on which projects? We finally through layers of conversations came to a decision that let us take about 5, 6, 7 the most recent projects. I also realized that there was another very important aspect emerging in the way we had selected these 6 projects. These 6 projects largely came only from 2 cities, 3 projects from Ahmedabad, 2 projects from Bombay, and I thought that was very, very important, because in a sense Bombay is the city from where he begins, and on the other hand Ahmedabad has an important or an interesting story in the career of Rahul Mehrotra, but also the studio. One of the projects that we look at is literally a most recent proposal at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya campus, but there are 3 or 4 buildings that Rahul Mehrotra studio has done in this campus. There were specific decisions on how we would present every project. There are photographs, but we have not sort of done essentially larger than life photographs, because it was important to look at the projects. Most of the project images are kept at a smaller size. So, one expects the viewer to look at the building at a close scale. On another level, I was very insistent that every project has to be represented through drawings. This quest also came from my discussions as research discussions with the team at RMA, where they were very often trying to explain to me that how certain conceptual ideas, they struggled through details, or they struggled through sort of many experiments with details to see an idea come through. So, the drawings here are essentially working drawings, and they are very specifically selected working drawings. So, if I told them that in this project the cross section is very important, they pulled out the cross sectional drawings, and here in fact for example this drawing is of the foundations of the Children's Museum, one of the most recent inserts at the CSMVS campus. This project is in a part of the site which is very heavily treed and wooded. So, when they started to sort of dig in for the foundations, they realized that the network of roots was very intense, and some of these trees were also included as part of the design of the building, which means it meant that the foundations had to be sort of designed and redesigned, understanding how the network of roots were functioning. The next project that we looked at, which is sort of the only project which is not either from Bombay or Ahmedabad, but it has an interesting Bombay connection in the way Rahul talks about it, is the Novartis campus building. And Rahul always talks about how to design a building in Basel, Switzerland. Actually, his learnings from Bombay became very important. The way he had to negotiate the cross section, because this was a building that had laboratories. Laboratories have a very fixed requirement of architecture, which leaves very little play for the architect. So, how in very small areas of the building program, he had to enable a certain kind of an architectural idea, how he had to deal with a facade in a context where the whole campus invites a large number of very important contemporary architects with very strong styles, with very strong language. And there he had to sit his building, which was also responding to a very stiff or a tight program, but also responding to the context of many different contemporary architects in the campus. And here he was saying that, you know, in a place like Bombay, we are talking about heritage, we are talking about the reference or the city's history. But here there was a different contemporary history I had to respond to. The Sept library building, the language of the louvers, which is seeming to become very important for many of the RMA projects, seems to take a full shape here, where it actually sort of contemporaneizes the campus. At one level, this is a simple element of architecture, the louvers, which has been with us across cultures, across times. But like I say, you know, whether you see the louvers in the Golconda building, or whether you see the louvers in Ahmedabad at the Milloner's building, or whether you see the louvers at the library building in Sept campus, these are all three instances of different louvers. And in that sense, the use of the louvers here in shaping the essential architecture of the building sitting within a campus is literally opening up new questions and new directions. We looked at actually the large furniture inserts, the carousels within which the students sort of sit. Fitting these sort of space furnitures within the armature of the building actually creates the different levels of reading, intimacy, work, movement. The next two buildings in Ahmedabad, the School of Arts and Sciences and the Public Policy building at the IIM Ahmedabad campus. Now, both these buildings are in fact, in my reading, further developing a very different and a stronger question of language in architecture. When you see the School of Arts and Sciences building, it appears like a large and sprawling building. But when you understand what the program of the building is, you realize that this was a campus, or this was a building that was constructed for programs that can be as specific as the sciences and programs that can be as open and liberal as the arts. These sort of different typologies had to be brought in together. So, a large network of undefined spaces actually compose this building, and then it is punctuated by very certain defined programs. So, for example, the library is specific, but the library also stands as an object in space, or the central axis of the building, which actually holds the whole building together. The louvers and they will be composed as the building grows with vertical gardens. They actually indicate the different spaces that are there. So, whether it is a staff room, whether it is a professor's office, whether it is a classroom, depending on what the function inside it, or whether it is a shared terrace, depending on that, the louvers will be sort of expressed, or the vertical gardens will be expressed on the facade, and depending on the climate and the day, the garden will change and the louvers will change. And which is why one of the drawings that we pick up here, which I believe was earlier developed by literally one of the younger site architects, was a flooring plan of the general spaces, because the open general common spaces are so important that to do a detailed flooring plan was very, very important in this case. And the same happens with IIM, the IIM campus building, the new public policy building, which is we all know that this is again another heritage campus. the original buildings designed by Louis Kahn, the new campus designed by Bimal Patel HCP, and this is probably the first non-Louis Kahn, non-HCP building on the IIM campus. And again here Rahul uses this and the studio uses the notion of a structural armature within which you have a general series of floating spaces, because being a building for public policy, it imagines a large number of guest lectures, it imagines a large number of open program teaching, and those kind of things will require large number of flexible spaces. In fact, these two buildings in my head were becoming so clearly a strongly architectural development that I sort of began by asking the studio if they had made axonometric drawings. But then my needs as a critic were becoming so sort of specific that at one point the team said that, you know, if as a critic and a curator you have a specific way of doing the building, why don't you generate the axonometric drawing? So then I actually put a small temporary studio of about 3 students from the CEPT campus who have been my students, and we developed these 2 axonometric drawings, one for each building. This for the School of Arts and Sciences, which talks about how the axis works within the required program, how certain elements sort of float, how a space is generated, and the same for the public policy building, the monumental ramp, the layering of the louvers, and behind the facade layer with including the ramp, you have the range of sort of open program discussion spaces for a public policy institution. From a curatorial and a critic perspective, these drawings were generated. The final building and 2 buildings that are represented in this exhibition are actually buildings that are in construction even right now. The School of Public Policy, the JSW School of Public Policy at IIM Ahmedabad is in construction. But another building that is really in construction was a crematorium project in Worli. Not only that this is the most recent project, but it is in many ways an exemplar of what Rahul Mehrotra imagines his studio to be. This was a project that comes from a trust, and they wanted to make a proposal to collect funding. And through that process, actually developing a project report, Mehrotra also got involved in helping the trust negotiate the city, negotiate collaboration, and what emerged is an architectural project. And this is what he says, that very often, but one will have to realize and understand what are the needs. As an architect, your job will become to propose projects there. Very often what I've realized about good architecture is that the city may be in a mess, but it's always possible to create small havens of public architecture. Here actually it is the hope that this kind of a project, that it will shape into a larger public space. I think most of these projects indicate that question of what is the relationship between architecture and public life. And this has been the driving aspect of conversation between Rahul and me. I picked up about 3 conversations and extracted just about 2 questions from each conversation. One is on the Shantiniketan housing building, residential building in Delhi. The other is from the KMC headquarters building in Hyderabad. And the third is the important Hathigaon project from Jaipur. I'll sort of quote these 2 questions that I asked. One question is very simple and very straightforward, but important. As an architect, what have you learned from this project? And my second question was, as an architectural practice in India today, what does a project of this nature mean to you? So this kind of, you know, thinking through the materiality, the details, the sort of the crazy life of any architectural project, the conceptual thinking never really stops. And this is something that has interested me in this practice. The last 2 elements that you literally see, one is this video screen, which is constantly images of the site. These are photographs taken by anybody and everybody in the office at different sites. So we close the exhibition with a second binary, or in a sense another binary, the site and the studio. Whoever may be the master architect, whatever may be the master architect, there is no architect and there is no studio that functions only as a single personality. So this a graphic literally includes practically everybody who has passed through RMA Architects Studio at some point or the other since its beginning. So, all the different names, whether they were principal architects, whether they were project architects, whether they were interns, administrators, model makers, office help, everybody is on a scale here, and this begins to indicate what length of time they have been there. So, if somebody sort of came in 95, 96, 97, 98, so 98 to now this person is here, and the color indicates what his or her role was earlier, if it changed, how did it change later, etc. Just one last element, what you see just at the end of the projects. RMA architects have had a habit of documenting every project once it closes and finishes. And very often this documentation has encouraged some of the clients to develop the documentation into books for private circulation or even handbooks. Depending on certain projects which have a nature of being repeated again and again, like a boutique store for example, Bandage, they developed a handbook of design. So, every Bandage store could take off certain details as they grow. And this also connects with the studio, because again in many research conversations one realized where they were sharing how certain details are developed or remembered in the studio by the names of certain people. So, in that sense between this sort of documentation and publication of projects, the studio space and the site space, this sort of culminates the literally the practical working space within which many of these ideas are actually possible and sort of get shaped and discussed. Thank you very much.
Kaivan, thank you very much for including this infographic which shows all the participants and collaborators of the firm, because it's really I think a great attribution and acknowledgement of everybody's input, and seeing this makes me also go back and reflect about 30 years of the practice, which is really the starting point of the exhibition. So this was a lovely bookend that you included this infographic, because essentially I think what you've done, and I think this is why it's been valuable for us at RMA, is you've picked up on working in Mumbai, which is a reflection of 30 years, and I think in a wonderful way extended that, because what you've done as a curator, and that's why this has been very helpful for us. We've done exhibitions on our own, but this is the first time we were, as I've written, curating with a curator. And I think you've added this dimension of distilling certain aspects, themes, rubrics, whatever we might call them, which are not so evident to us, because ideas travel over time and ideas manifest themselves more sharply at particular moments or in particular projects. But by the kind of distillation that you've done and bought a kind of family of things that refer to a particular rubric, whether it's the sectional manipulations or the use of terracotta, we were not so conscious about it. We were doing it in responses that we thought were appropriate for that site, for that program, for the form that we thought was appropriate. And so I think this distilling has been very, very important. And so thank you for that. And has really added a wonderful dimension for us to understand the projects. The other thing that in reflection, now that we are reflecting on this, is that we were, and I speak as RMA architects, a bit nervous about the fact that this would be 30 years of the firm, and therefore it kind of becomes retrospective, which is also overwhelming to think of 3 decades. But I think what you have very nicely done is also made it projective by curating and selecting 6 projects, of which 2 or 2.5, I suppose, are yet under construction. So it's also pointing to a future, because it gives it a kind of projective dimension, which I think was very nice for us to suddenly see things that are in progress, where yet some design decisions are being made, but they're in the context of a kind of retrospective. This notion that there's a kind of lovely tension between what is retrospective and what is projective, as both as ideas, but also as artifacts, that I think in reflection has become much more evident. And lastly, I think one of the things that really I've been thinking a lot about is the way you centered the exhibition so much on models. Models are just part. We had partitions that were model racks that we began to store them. Before that, periodically, we just got rid of models. Suddenly, you've sort of made us much more aware of their existence among our myths and the life that they have within the practice, and putting them on a table to converse with each other also makes us aware of the continuity of ideas and elements within this, but also how much it is really part of the process. It's a kind of celebration, which is nice. And I think also what's ironical is that in the pandemic, when one would have thought everything would be virtual and maybe there were just projections on the wall and things, and when the digital has become, an overwhelming kind of format, by taking the models, even for the 4,000 or 5,000 out people who had the privilege or the advantage of coming and seeing these in space, it's a wonderful reminder of tangibility. It's a wonderful reminder that there's life beyond the digital. And so I very much personally, and I think all of us at RMA, as well as Architecture Foundation, ELA in particular, are very grateful that that's the format it took, because it really finally celebrated an aspect of our practice that was very precious, very important, for us, but I suppose it was just so much part of our life that we, in a sense, took it for granted. And so I think in conclusion, you're posing this as the architecture of practice allowed a framework which allowed for me personally to see many of my varied activities and interests intersect. But what it allowed for, I think, RMA architects as a practice is to see the larger construct of not only my situation within the practice, but their situation within the practice. And also in terms of the kind of thematics that we become aware of only through the eyes of a curator. And it's often hard to discern, because for us, we are living with these ideas, we are living with elements that have their own life as they sort of move through projects. The vertical louvers is a case in point where, 20 years ago, we developed them in metal and glass in the Prince of Wales Museum, and here in conjunction with a wonderful vendor, Face, in Ahmedabad, it took on a completely different life, and suddenly something that was hidden as an impulse that we wanted to use in projects suddenly surfaced because of these intersections, which you then capture very well in the exhibition through the full-scale mock-up and other formats. So I think, in short, I think working through the lens of a curator has added many dimensions, which I think will be important for people to understand the work. But I think most importantly, I think the contribution, and maybe this is speaking selfishly, is I think what we will at RMA Architects learn from the new ways you have configured and looked at some of the materials. So thank you very much.